Revna did not throw anything at him. That was the part no one could stop talking about afterward. Not the speech, not the announcement, not the way the entire court had drawn a collective breath, like they were watching someone step off the edge of a cliff. No, what haunted them, what haunted him, was that she did not throw anything at him. She should have any reasonable woman in her position would have. The goblets on the council table were solid bronze and heavy enough to leave a mark. The candlesticks were iron. There was a decorative shield on the eastern wall that would have made a spectacular projectile and an even more spectacular point. She had options. She used none of them. The Luna's circlet sat in her hair, delicate silver woven with moonstone, placed there by the king's own hands 6 weeks ago. She remembered that morning, with a clarity that felt cruel now. His fingers in her hair, careful and deliberate. The way he'd stepped back to look at her, and something behind his eyes had gone very still, very soft. "It suits you," he'd said, and his voice had cracked on the second word, and she had believed him. The Luna wing had been prepared for her, its rooms aired and furnished, fresh wild flowers on every surface, because someone had noticed she preferred them to hothouse arrangements, candles lit in every window. A writing desk positioned beside the east, facing glass where the morning light fell warm and golden. She had been chosen, named claimed. And now? Standing in a throne room packed with 300 wolves, Revna was listening to her king announce his mating to another woman. The silence was suffocating. It pressed against her from every direction, thick and terrible, like being held underwater. Revna could feel every pair of eyes in the room crawling over her, searching her face for the crack, for the first tremor that would become a fracture that would become the spectacular public collapse they were all waiting for. She could feel Calder's gaze, heaviest of all, fixed on her from the dais, his jaw tight, his body rigid with something she might once have mistaken for regret. Melisande stood beside him. Tall, poised, everything Revna was not. Daughter of the Northern Alpha, whose border forces had held the Ashanmore frontier for 3 generations, the alliance made perfect strategic sense. Revna understood that she was practical enough to understand that. What she could not understand was why he had let her believe otherwise. 6 weeks. He had given her 6 weeks of careful, tentative, devastating hope, of mornings in the Luna wing where the light came through the east windows like honey, of evenings where his voice softened just for her, where his fingers had brushed hers across a table and lingered, of his wolf pressing forward behind his eyes when he looked at her. A recognition so deep it made her bones ache. 6 weeks of a fated bond settling into her chest like it had always been there, and now this Revna's hands were steady. That surprised her. She'd expected trembling, expected her body to betray the earthquake happening beneath her ribs. But her hands were steady and her spine was straight, and her face was calm. She reached up and removed the circlet from her hair. The motion was small, unhurried, and it stopped every heart in the room. She held it for a moment, feeling the cool weight of the silver against her palm. Then she stepped forward, placed it gently on the edge of the nearest table, and stepped back. "I wish you both every happiness," she said. Her voice did not crack. It carried across the silent room, clear and warm and sincere, and that sincerity was what destroyed him. She meant it. She actually, genuinely meant it. She would be proud of that later in private, when the pride was the only thing she had left to hold. Then she turned and walked toward the doors. The crowd parted for her like water. No one spoke. No one touched her. One woman near the aisle pressed a hand to her own mouth, her eyes bright with tears. But Revna did not see it. She was looking ahead, only ahead, her chin level, her shoulders back, her footsteps steady on the stone floor. The walk from the table to the doors was 42 steps. She counted every one. The throne room doors closed behind her with a sound that carried through the vaulted ceiling like the last note of a hymn. And in the silence that followed, 300 wolves stared at their king and found him wanting. Calder stood on his dais and felt something inside his chest crack open in a way he had not anticipated and could not name. Millicent stood beside him, her posture flawless, her expression composed, but he could see the slight furrow between her brows. She had expected a scene too. They had all expected a scene. He had counted on it. She was supposed to fight. He had expected rage, tears, accusations. He'd braced for a scene, the kind of passionate, furious confrontation that would have given him an excuse to falter, to hesitate, to let the council see that the choice was impossible. If she had fought, he could have been forced to reconsider. If she had screamed or wept or thrown the circlet at his head, there would have been grounds for delay. Instead, she had smiled at him, warm and genuine and so unbearably kind that it had cut through his chest like a blade. And now she was gone. By midnight, the Luna wing was empty. Every trace of her removed with quiet, methodical precision. The linens were folded with hospital corners, the candles were snuffed, the wardrobe held nothing but wooden hangers and lavender sachets she'd left behind because they belonged to the palace, not to her. The wildflowers on the windowsill had been placed in water before she left, stems freshly trimmed as if she wanted them to live a little longer even after she was gone. She had taken only what she'd arrived with, a leather satchel, 3 dresses, a tin of dye pigments, her grandmother's wooden comb on the pillow. Centered with care, she had left a single pressed sprig of heather, the same heather that grew wild in Thornfeld, the village she had come from. Beneath it, a note in her careful slanting hand, 2 words: "Be well. Not be sorry. Not be damned. Be well." Calder stood in the empty room at 3 in the morning, surrounded by the fading ghost of her scent, and stared at the heather for a very long time. The moonlight fell through the east window, across the bare desk, across the empty chair, across a room that still held the shape of her even after she had left it. Then he picked up the heather and crushed it in his fist. But he did not throw it away. He put it in his pocket, and he did not take it out, and weeks later it was still there, flattened and dry and crumbling. And he still could not throw it away. 3 weeks. That was how long it took for the Alpha King of Ashenmore to stop pretending he was fine. The first week had been manageable. He had thrown himself into the alliance negotiations with Millicent's father, Lord Heron, burying himself in trade agreements and border logistics until the work swallowed everything else he ate, when reminded. He attended council. He nodded at the appropriate moments and signed the documents placed before him. Millicent was gracious and efficient beside him. Everything a political Luna should be. And he felt nothing, that was the problem. He felt nothing at all where she was concerned, and too much everywhere else. He did not sleep, not properly, not for more than an hour at a time before his wolf clawed him awake, howling at the emptiness on the other side of the bond like a wound that would not close. His wolf had always been disciplined, controlled, obedient, a soldier's wolf, hard-won through years of training and iron will. Now it paced inside him constantly, agitated and furious, scraping against the inside of his ribs with a restlessness that made his skin crawl. It wanted her. It did not understand politics or alliances or strategic necessity. It only understood that its mate was gone and that its human half was the reason. By the second week, the cracks began to show. He lost the thread of a council meeting and had to ask Councillor Doran to repeat himself 3 times. He snapped at a servant for bringing the wrong tea, then immediately felt sick with shame because he'd never been that man, that king. He stood in corridors with his hand on the wall, trying to remember where he'd been going, the destination dissolving like smoke every time he reached for it. He walked past the Luna Wing. One evening, without meaning to, the door was shut. He'd ordered it sealed. No one was to enter, no one was to clean it, no one was to touch anything inside. When Millicent had asked if she could move her things in, the growl that had escaped him had been so low and so savage that she'd taken 2 steps backward before composing herself. She hadn't asked again. Oswin, his beta, said nothing about any of it, but the careful way the man watched him, The way his gaze tracked Calder's movements with the quiet alertness of someone monitoring a structural failure said everything. Oswin had served 3 generations of Ashamor kings. He had seen wars, plagues, and one particularly disastrous diplomatic incident involving a visiting dignitary and an unsecured stable door. He had never seen his king unravel like this. By the 3rd week, Calder's hands had developed a faint tremor he could not control. He stood at the window of his study, watching the courtyard below, without seeing it. The light hurt his eyes. Everything hurt his eyes. Sleep deprivation had turned the world into something slightly too bright, slightly too sharp, slightly too loud. "You look terrible," Oswin said from the doorway. "Thank you," Calder replied. "The Thornfeld matter." Oswin stepped inside and closed the door. "We need to discuss it." Calder's jaw tightened at the name. Thornfeld. He hadn't said the word aloud in 3 weeks, as if not speaking it could keep the reality of it at arm's length. She had gone back there, back to the village she'd come from, the one nestled in the western hills, where the heather grew thick and the dye trade kept the economy alive. She had simply gone home, like the 6 weeks in his castle, in his life, had been a holiday she'd finished with. "There's nothing to discuss," Calder said. "The border wards in the western corridor have weakened," Oswin continued, his voice carefully neutral. "The ward stones respond to the Luna's presence. Without a bonded Luna in the wing, their strength has been declining steadily. 3 stones have gone dim in the past week alone." Calder turned to look at him. "Then Melisande will take the wing? Melisande has not been recognized by the wards?" "She has tried." Oswin paused, letting the weight of that settle. "The stones went cold when she entered, dead cold. The head wardkeeper said it was as if the wing itself rejected her. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. The wards recognize a fated bond," Oswin said quietly, "not a political arrangement. They always have. Every Luna in Ashamor's history has been a fated mate. The magic doesn't bend for convenience." Calder's fist came down on the desk hard enough to crack the wood. A line split through the dark grain, clean and sudden, and a pot of ink toppled and bled black across a stack of unsigned trade agreements. "I did not ask for your interpretation," he growled. Oswin didn't flinch. 30 years of service to the crown had given him an immunity to royal tantrums that bordered on supernatural. He simply moved the ruined documents out of the ink's path and continued. "The western villages are noticing," the beta said. "Livestock falling ill. Crops not taking to the soil despite good weather. 2 shepherd families have relocated east, closer to stronger ward lines. The healer in Thornfeld has sent 2 messages to the palace asking about the ward fluctuations. She is concerned. I think we should be, too." Calder went. "Still, the healer in Thornfeld, Ceres, an old wolf, well respected. She recognized the symptoms of ward decay immediately. She's been reinforcing her village's local protections with herb work and rune circles, but she says it won't hold much longer without the main ward lying restored." "And Revna?" The name came out before he could stop it. Rough and raw, like a sound dragged from somewhere he blocked shut. He heard himself say it, and hated the need in his own voice, hated the way the syllables felt like relief and agony at the same time. Oswin's expression softened, just barely. A hairline fracture in the beta's composure that said more than any speech could have. "Ceres reports she's working. Taken over the village dye house producing indigo and madder cloth for market." He paused. "She seems well. She seems well." 3 words, and each one landed like a blow to the sternum. He was falling apart. He hadn't slept properly in 21 days. His hand shook. His wolf was tearing itself to pieces inside him. He'd cracked his own desk in half, and she seemed well. "She's not affected by the bond?" Calder asked, hating the desperation in his own voice, hating that he was asking, hating that the answer mattered so much it made his teeth ache. Oswin hesitated. That hesitation told him more than any answer could have. "Ceres says she's working long hours," the beta said carefully. Keeping busy, very busy. Calder heard what wasn't said. Keeping busy could mean anything. It could mean she was thriving, free of him, relieved. It could mean she was doing exactly what he was doing, drowning herself in work to avoid the thing that was eating her alive, smiling through it because she had always been better at carrying pain quietly than anyone he had ever known. "I'll send a contingent to inspect the western wards," Calder said, turning back to the window. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, hollow-eyed and grim. He barely recognized himself. Standard procedure, routine assessment. "Of course," Oswin replied, and the slightest shift in his tone, a careful neutrality that was somehow worse than sarcasm, suggested he knew exactly what this was. Standard procedure did not typically involve the king's personal attendance. Routine assessments did not typically target the specific village where the king's rejected fated mate had taken up residence. "Shall I arrange your horse, or will you take the carriage?" Calder's head snapped toward him. "I didn't say I was going." "My mistake," Oswin said, entirely unapologetic. He was already turning toward the door. "I'll arrange the horse. We'll leave at John." Oswin the Beta paused. "This is about the wards," Calder said. "Nothing else." Oswin looked at him for a long, measured moment. The kind of look that said he had watched this man grow from a reckless boy into a capable king, and he had never once seen him lie this badly. "Of course, sire," Oswin said. The wards he left before Calder could argue. Alone in his study, Calder pressed both hands flat against the cracked desk and tried to breathe through the ache in his chest. The bond pulled westward, always westward, a constant gravitational drag toward a woman who had smiled at him and walked away. He could feel her out there, faint and distant, like a heartbeat heard through a wall, alive, unreachable. She was supposed to fight for him. That thought circled and circled, relentless, worn smooth by repetition. She was supposed to fight. But the uglier truth, the one he couldn't outrun, no matter how many documents he signed, or meetings he attended, or walls he put between himself and the empty Luna wing, surfaced beneath it like a body rising from deep water. He was supposed to choose her, and he hadn't. Thornfeld sat in a fold of the western hills, tucked between ridgelines, like a secret someone had whispered and forgotten. The buildings were old stone with slate roofs, softened by moss and weather. Smoke curled from chimneys. Sheep dotted the upper pastures. The heather, wild and purple and relentless, crept across every surface the village hadn't actively fought back. Calder arrived with a retinue of 6. Oswin at his side. 4 guards behind, and a thoroughly unconvincing story about a ward inspection tour. He had rehearsed what he would say. On the ride, he had constructed and dismantled approximately 14 different opening statements, ranging from regal authority to something that sounded embarrassingly close to begging. By the time the village appeared on the horizon, he had settled on dignified concern. He was here in an official capacity. The wards needed attention. If the former occupant of the Luna Wing happened to live here, that was simply a geographical coincidence. He believed none of this, and neither did Oswin, who had the decency not to comment. They found her at the dye house. It was a long, low building at the edge of the village, its stone walls stained in streaks of indigo and madder and welled yellow. Steam rose from the open doorway, carrying the rich, earthy smell of mordant and crushed plant matter. Calder dismounted and handed his reins to a guard. His pulse was doing something deeply undignified. He stepped through the doorway and stopped. Revna stood at a broad wooden vat, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her arms stained blue to the wrists. Her hair was tied back with a strip of linen, and a smudge of indigo marked her cheekbone like a bruise. She was stirring the vat with a long paddle, her movements rhythmic and practiced, and she was humming. She was humming something, and his chest compressed so violently, he nearly gasped. She looked up. Their eyes met. And for one raw, unguarded second, he saw it. The flash of something desperate and aching behind her composure, the way her hands stilled on the paddle, the slight catch in her breath. Then the mask slid back into place, smooth and practiced, and she smiled. "Your Majesty," she said, warm and easy, like he was any visitor, like his presence in her dye house was perfectly ordinary. "What a surprise! Mind the threshold, the boards are uneven." Calder stood in the doorway and felt all 14 rehearsed speeches evaporate. "Revna," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Would you like some tea?" she offered, setting the paddle against the vat. "I've got chamomile, or nettle. The nettle's better, but I should warn you the cups don't match." She was being kind to him. She was standing in a dye house with blue hands and a borrowed apron, offering him tea in mismatched cups, and she was being kind to him after what he had done. It was worse than if she had screamed. "I'm here to inspect the western wards," he said. "Of course you are." Her tone held no sarcasm, just a quiet knowing that made him feel utterly transparent. "The wardstone nearest here is up on Cairn Hill. I can show you the path if you'd like." "That won't be necessary." He paused. "How are you?" "Well, thank you." She said it simply, with that same steady warmth, and he searched her face for the lie. Her eyes were clear. Her posture was relaxed. She looked by every visible measure like a woman who had moved on, but the bond told a different story. At this distance, barely 10 feet between them, the bond was a roaring, living thing in his chest. It pulsed with recognition, with need, with the desperate magnetic pull that had kept him awake for 3 weeks. And beneath her composure, if he reached through the connection, he could feel the echo of it in her, faint but unmistakable. She was holding it down with sheer will, pressing the ache beneath the surface through force of stubborn, ferocious discipline. She was suffering. She was just better at hiding it than he was. "The dye work suits you," he said, because he was apparently incapable of saying anything that mattered. "It always did." She wiped her hands on the apron. "Ashenmore was the detour. This is the life." The words landed precisely where she intended them, and the impact knocked the air from his lungs. "This is the life, not that one. Not the one with him." Oswin appeared in the doorway behind him. "The village elder is asking to meet your Majesty." Calder didn't move. Revna watched him, her expression patient and utterly unreadable. He wanted to say something, needed to say something. The words pressed against the inside of his teeth, crowding and desperate. "Come back, I made a mistake. I can't sleep without you." But he was a king, and kings did not stand in dye houses with their hearts in their throats, begging forgiveness from women they had wronged. At least, not in front of their beatas and a room full of indigo. "Thank you for your time," Calder said. "Any time, Your Majesty." That smile again, warm, genuine, devastating. He turned and left the meeting with the village elder. Lasted an hour. Calder retained approximately none of it. He inspected the ward stone on Cairn Hill and confirmed what he already knew. It was weakening. The protective barrier it anchored, the one that kept the western border secure, was thinning like ice in spring, without a true Luna bond to sustain it. The entire western ward line would fail within months. That night they made camp at the edge of the village. Calder sat in his tent, his hands wrapped around a cup he hadn't drunk from, and stared at the canvas wall. Her scent was on him, just from standing in the same room. The indigo and chamomile and something beneath it that was purely her had seeped into his clothes and his skin and the inside of his lungs. His wolf, for the first time in 3 weeks, was quiet, not content, but no longer howling, just pressed forward, ears up, alert and aching, and focused entirely westward, toward a stone building at the edge of the village where a woman with blue hands was probably lying awake too. He closed his eyes. He fell asleep within minutes. It was the first real sleep he'd had since the night before the announcement. Deep and heavy and dreamless, his body surrendering so completely that when Oswin shook him awake the next morning, Calder didn't know where he was. "You slept," Oswin said. There was something careful in his voice. Cautious, Like a man holding a lit match near kindling, Calder sat up slowly. His body felt strange, rested. The tremor in his hands had stopped. "How long?" he asked. 9 hours. 9 hours. He hadn't slept 9 consecutive hours since Revna had moved into the Luna Wing 6 weeks ago, and her scent had wrapped around him every night like a promise. Since she had moved out, he had slept in tortured fragments. 40 minutes here. An hour there. Never deep. Never enough. Never without his wolf snarling him awake to search for something that wasn't there. And now, 200 yards from her, with her scent still clinging to his shirt, he had slept like the dead. The implications settled over him like a stone. He couldn't sleep without her, not near enough to smell her, not close enough for the bond to settle. His body knew what his pride refused to admit. She was his, and he had given her away, and the absence was killing him. They broke camp within the hour. Calder mounted his horse, his jaw set, his spine rigid, as they rode past the dye house. He glanced toward the door. Revna stood in the threshold watching them leave. She raised one blue-stained hand in a small unhurried wave. Then she turned and went back inside. Calder rode for 20 minutes before he spoke. "Oswin, sire, how do I fix this?" The beta was quiet for a long time. Then he said, very carefully, "That depends on what you're willing to lose." Calder stared at the road ahead and felt the bond stretch between them like a wire pulled taut, vibrating with every yard of distance. "Everything," he said. Apparently the ride back to Eshen Moor was long and punishing. By nightfall the tremor in Calder's hands had returned. Her scent faded from his clothes within hours of leaving Thornfeld. He knew because he checked. Discreetly at first, turning his collar toward his face, while pretending to adjust it against the wind. Then, less discreetly, pressing his sleeve to his nose, while Oswin rode beside him, and politely pretended not to notice. By the time the castle appeared on the horizon, her scent was gone entirely, replaced by horse leather and dust and the metallic tang of his own exhaustion. The insomnia had already come roaring back. His wolf paced and snarled and clawed at the bond like an animal trying to dig through a locked door. Every mile east was a mile further from her, and his body punished him for each one. He arrived at Ashamore to a crisis. Councillor Doran met him in the courtyard before he'd dismounted, his face drawn tight, a roll of dispatches clutched in one hand. "Sire, there's been an attack. The village of Brackenmere 2 nights ago. A rogue pack breached the western ward line where the 3rd and 4th stones went dark. Calder's blood went cold. Casualties? 7 injured. 2 critically. A girl barely 14 and her grandfather. They were closest to the breach when the rogues came through." Doran's voice was steady, but his hands were not. The healer from the nearest settlement stabilized them, but the ward barrier that should have held the rogues back was barely a shimmer. Scouts say it flickered twice and died. It might as well have been open air. The council meeting that followed was brutal. Maps were spread across the long table, ward lines marked in red ink that looked too much like blood. 3 more stones had gone dark in the week Calder had been away. The western barrier was failing in a slow, widening collapse, like a wall losing bricks one by one at the current rate of decay. The entire western frontier would be unprotected within 2 months. "The ward stones require a bonded Luna," Councillor Doran said, not for the first time, the exhaustion in his voice suggesting he was tired of stating the obvious to people who refused to hear it. "This has been true since the first stones were laid. 300 years ago, every generation of Ashamore kings has sustained them through the Luna bond. Without it, the magic starves." "Then we find another way to sustain them," Calder said. "There is no other way." This from Helwyn, the ancient ward keeper, who rarely spoke in council and was listened to carefully when she did. She sat in the corner, with her gnarled hands folded on her cane, her eyes sharp as flint beneath a crown of white hair that looked like it had been styled by a strong wind. and an attitude problem. The stones are not machines, your majesty. They are living magic, bound to the land, bound to the Luna, bound to the bond between her and the king. You cannot trick them with a substitute any more than you can trick a river into flowing uphill. I've tried, believe me, I've tried. The silence that followed was pointed enough to draw blood. Millicent, seated at the far end of the table, said nothing. But Calder could see the set of her jaw, the careful blankness she had perfected over weeks of being the woman who was chosen but not wanted. She was not stupid. She had never been stupid. She knew exactly what this conversation meant, and the dignity with which she bore it made him feel like the worst man alive. "Bring the dyer back," Helwen said flatly. The old woman had no patience for political delicacy, and even less for royal ego. "Bring the girl whose hand made the central stone, sing like it hasn't sung in a decade. I don't care what you call the arrangement. Call her a consultant. Call her a ward specialist. Call her a dancing bear if it helps her pride. But bring her back before the western border becomes a graveyard." Calder's jaw tightened so hard he felt the muscles jump beneath his skin. "Oswin," he said, "send word to Thornfeld." The letter took him 4 hours to write. He drafted and discarded 11 versions, each one more pathetic than the last, before settling on language so stiffly formal it could have been a tax notice. He requested her presence at Ashamore in an advisory capacity regarding ward restoration. He offered fair compensation and suitable accommodation. He made no mention of the bond, or the sleepless nights, or the sprig of heather still crumbling in his coat pocket, or the fact that he had pressed his face into a shirt that smelled like indigo and wept once in the dark like a man who deserved no sympathy. Revna's reply arrived 3 days later. One line written in her careful, slanting hand on a scrap of parchment that smelled faintly of dye. "I'll come for the wards, not for you." Even her rejection was graceful. She arrived on a Tuesday, under gray skies that matched the mood of the castle perfectly. Calder watched from his study window as the cart pulled through the gates. A simple farmer's wagon with a canvas cover, carrying a woman with a leather satchel and 3 dresses, and hands still faintly stained with indigo. She climbed down without assistance, declined the footman's outstretched hand with a polite shake of her head, and stood in the courtyard for a moment, looking up at the castle walls. He studied her face from 3 stories above, trying to read the expression there. She looked smaller than he remembered. Or maybe the castle just looked bigger around her, the way it always had, a reminder that this was a world she'd been borrowed into, not born for. Then she squared her shoulders, adjusted the satchel strap, and walked toward the entrance with the same steady, unhurried stride she'd used to walk out of the throne room. No fear, no hesitation, just a woman, keeping her word. His wolf pressed forward so hard behind his eyes that his vision blurred, and his hands gripped the window frame until the wood creaked. Oswin had arranged quarters for her in the east corridor, close enough to the Luna wing for practical access to the ward stones but pointedly separate from it, a distinction Revna would notice immediately and understand completely. She was not being invited back as Luna. She was being hired as help. The difference was a knife's edge, and both of them were balanced on it. Their first meeting was held in the ward chamber, a circular room beneath the castle's foundation where the central ward stone sat in its iron cradle, dark and cold and lifeless. The ceiling was low, the walls ancient, the air carrying the mineral smell of deep stone and old magic gone quiet. Helwen was there, leaning on her cane with the air of someone who had been waiting for this moment with limited patience. Oswin was there, positioned near the door with his usual expression of calculated neutrality, and Calder stood against the far wall with his arms crossed and tried to look like a king instead of a man who hadn't slept in 6 days and whose entire body was vibrating with the proximity of the woman standing 10 feet away. Revna stepped toward the stone. She didn't hesitate, didn't perform, didn't look at anyone for permission. She simply placed both hands on its surface. The stone erupted in light. It blazed white, then silver, then a deep, pulsing blue that filled the chamber and turned the air electric. Helwyn stumbled backward. Oswin caught her arm. The light rippled outward from the stone, in waves racing through the grooves carved into the floor, following the ward lines that connected this central stone to every boundary marker on Ashamore's border. For 3 heartbeats, the entire ward network was visible, a web of light radiating from the room, from Revna's hands, from the place where her skin touched ancient stone, and in that light, Calder could see the damage. Dark patches where stones had failed, gaps in the web where the magic had frayed, the western border, a ragged, barely glowing thread that should have been a blazing wall. The light faded. Revna pulled her hands back and stared at them. "Well," Helwyn said into the ringing silence, "I think that settles the question of whether she's the one." Revna looked at Calder across the chamber. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She hadn't expected that any more than he had. "I'm here for the wards," she said, and her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "That's all." Calder nodded once, not trusting himself to speak, because the light from the stone was still fading from her skin, and she looked like something sacred, and his wolf was howling so loudly inside him that he was surprised no one else could hear it. A routine formed, as routines do, in the space between what people say and what they actually mean. Revna worked on the ward stones each morning, moving methodically through the network, coaxing light back into dormant markers, tracing fracture lines in the ancient magic with her fingertips like a physician reading a pulse. Helwyn accompanied her, taking notes in a letter journal so old the pages crackled when she turned them, muttering occasionally about unprecedented readings and anomalous resonance patterns, and the most naturally attuned ward hand I've seen in 40 years, and I include myself in that count. Revna said little during these sessions. She worked with quiet, focused intensity, her hands steady, her concentration absolute. The stones responded to her with an eagerness that bordered on devotion. Dark markers brightened at her approach. Cracked tiles sealed themselves under her palms. The blue glow that followed her through the ward network grew stronger each day, until Helwyn started calling it the girl's shadow and made notes about it with undisguised academic excitement. Calder found reasons to be in the ward chamber. Legitimate reasons, naturally. The ward restoration was a matter of national security, and the king should be informed of progress. It was entirely appropriate for him to observe. The fact that observing meant standing within 15 feet of Revna, close enough to catch her scent on every inhale, close enough to watch the way her brow furrowed when she concentrated and the way her lips moved silently as she traced the old ward's sigils, was a geographical coincidence. Revna did not acknowledge his presence beyond the expected courtesies. "Good morning, Your Majesty." The third southern marker is restored. "Your Majesty." "Excuse me, Your Majesty, you're standing on a ward line." She was unfailingly polite, professionally warm, completely, maddeningly, impenetrably courteous. It was driving him slowly out of his mind. On the 4th day, Calder arrived at the ward chamber to find Revna sitting cross-legged on the stone floor, her palms pressed flat against a cracked ward tile, her eyes closed. The blue glow pulsed gently beneath her hands like a sleeping heartbeat, rhythmic and warm. She was humming the same low, absent melody he'd heard in the dye house, and the wardstone was humming back. The sound resonated in the chamber walls, in the floor, in his bones. He stood in the doorway and watched her, and the ache in his chest was so acute it took his breath. She belonged here. The ward magic knew it. The stones knew it. Every particle of ancient energy in this castle knew it. The only people still pretending otherwise were him and her, and he was losing conviction faster than she was. Small things accumulated. She mended a torn hem on his cloak one afternoon, when she found it draped over a chair in the war chamber. Quick, practiced stitches, invisible and precise, the kind of repair that came from years of making do with less. She folded it and replaced it exactly where she'd found it without saying a word. He only noticed because Oswin told him, And then he stood in his study, running his thumb over the neat, perfect stitches and feeling something tighten in his throat that he could not swallow past. He started leaving tea outside her door each morning. Chamomile, because she'd offered him chamomile in Thornfeld, and the detail had lodged in his memory like a splinter he couldn't reach. The first morning, the cup sat untouched until it went cold. The second morning, it was empty when he walked past. The third morning, there was a cup waiting for him too. Nettle, still steaming, she'd remembered. Neither of them mentioned it. It became their language. The silent, careful dialect of two people who could not say what they meant. His sleep improved. Not dramatically. Not the 9-hour collapse he'd experienced in Thornfeld, but the sharp edges of the insomnia dulled with her under the same roof. He managed 4 hours, then 5. His wolf still paced, still pressed forward, but the howling subsided into something quieter, a low, persistent whine, like a dog at a closed door. Wanting, not desperate, Revna knew. He could tell from the way she glanced at him in the mornings, a quick, assessing look that catalogued the shadows under his eyes with clinical precision before her gaze moved on. She never asked. She never commented. But sometimes, when she thought he wasn't watching, her composure would slip just enough for him to see the exhaustion she carried too, the careful way she pressed her fingers to her temples, the slight unsteadiness in her hands at the end of a long word session. She was sleeping badly. The bond did not spare her just because she'd been the one to walk away. On the 6th day, Melisande came to find Revna in the ward chamber. Calder was not there. He heard about it afterward from Oswin, who heard it from a guard stationed at the door. But the guard's account was detailed enough that Calder could picture it with uncomfortable clarity. Melisande had entered quietly, her bearing as composed as ever, her hands folded in front of her the way she always held them, a posture of deliberate, practiced grace. She'd waited until Helwyn left for her afternoon rest, then sat down on the stone bench across from Revna and smoothed her skirts over her knees. "I want you to know," Melisande said, "that I have no illusions about what this arrangement is." Revna looked at her, startled, her hands still glowing faintly blue from the ward work. "My father needs the alliance," Melisande continued. Her voice was steady and clear and carried no bitterness, which made it worse. "And your king needed a solution that didn't require him to be brave. I was the solution. I understood that when I agreed." She paused. "What I didn't expect was to like you." Revna's composure, that unshakable, infuriating, beautiful composure that Calder had been trying to crack for weeks, faltered. Her eyes went bright and she pressed her lips together hard. "I don't hate you," Revna said softly. "I could never hate you. None of this is your fault." "No," Melisande agreed. "It's his." She stood, smoothing her skirts with the same deliberate grace. "For what it's worth, the ward stones never responded to me, not even a flicker. I touched the central stone and it felt like pressing my hand against a wall, cold and closed and completely indifferent." She met Revna's eyes. "I think the magic knows what he's too stubborn to say." She left without looking back, and the guard reported that Revna sat alone in the ward chamber for a very long time afterward, her hands clasped in her lap, the blue glow fading from her fingers like the last light of a long day. That evening something happened that changed everything. Revna was tracing a ward line through the east corridor, following the carved groove in the floor with her fingertips as the blue glow guided her forward. The line turned, a corner, ran along the baseboard, and passed beneath a door she hadn't opened, before she pushed it open and stepped through the Luna wing. It hit her like a wall. The scent of old wildflowers, dried now but still present in the sachets she left behind. The moonlight through the east windows, falling across the bare desk, the empty chair, the bed she had slept in for 6 weeks while believing she'd found her home, and beneath her feet the ward line blazed. Every stone in the Luna wing ignited simultaneously. The crystals in the chandelier flared white, the candles on the mantel burst into flame without being touched. The window glass shimmered with a blue iridescence that threw dancing light across the walls. The ward, magic, dormant for weeks, roared back to life like it had been holding its breath, waiting for her return. Revna stood in the center of it, surrounded by light, her heart hammering, her hands pressed over her mouth. Footsteps in the corridor, fast, heavy. Alarmed by the light, Calder appeared in the doorway. He stared at her, at the blazing ward stones, at the Luna wing, alive and luminous around the woman he had tried to replace. Revna, he breathed. She looked at him through the light, and for the first time since the throne room her mask cracked completely. Not with anger, not with accusation, with grief so raw and so deep that it made him stagger. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered. By morning, the entire court knew. Servants talked. Guards talked. The scullery maid who'd been emptying chamber pots in the east corridor told the laundress, who told the stable master, who told his wife, who told everyone she met at the morning market. The ward light had been visible from the courtyard, blazing through the Luna wing windows like a signal fire, and there was no version of the story that didn't end with the same devastating conclusion. The magic had chosen. The ward stones, ancient and immovable and utterly indifferent to political convenience, had declared their Luna. And their Luna was not Millicent. The council meeting that followed was the worst of Calder's reign. Lord Heron had arrived overnight, riding hard from the northern border, summoned by his daughter's urgent message. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that had been carved by decades of standing in cold wind and making difficult decisions. He stood at the opposite end of the table from Calder with his hands flat on the wood and his voice pitched to carry through stone walls. "We had an agreement," Heron said. "My daughter for your border, my army for your crown. My family's honor for your political convenience. You gave your word." "Ashworth in front of witnesses, the agreement stands," Calder said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth and his wolf snarled at every syllable. "Does it?" Heron's gaze could have stripped paint from the walls. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you brought your fated mate back into your castle, housed her steps from the Luna wing, and let the ward magic announce to everyone within eyeshot that my daughter is not your Luna. My daughter who has conducted herself with more grace and dignity in this impossible situation than you deserve." His voice dropped dangerous and controlled. "So tell me, Your Majesty, what exactly does your word look like from where I stand?" Calder had no answer for that, because Heron was right, every single word of it. And the worst part was that Millicent, seated beside her father, with her hands folded in her lap, did not look angry. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had spent weeks performing a role she never wanted in a story that was never hers, and she was simply waiting for someone to have the courage to end it. The council fractured along predictable lines. The military advisors wanted the Northern Alliance preserved at any cost. The ward-keeper Helwyn argued that without Revna, the Western wards would fail entirely, and neither frontier would matter. Councillor Doran tried to broker a compromise that pleased no one, and through it all, Calder sat at the head of the table and felt the bond pulling toward the east corridor, toward a woman who had come for the wards and not for him, and was probably packing her bags again while he sat here drowning in a mess of his own making. He found her in her quarters that evening. She was not packing, which surprised him. She was sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, her hands in her lap, staring at the far wall with an expression of such deep, controlled exhaustion that it stopped him in the doorway. "I'm not leaving," she said before he could speak. She didn't turn to look at him. "Not until the words are stable. I gave my word. And unlike some people, I keep mine." The barb landed cleanly. And he deserved it. Relief crashed through him so hard, his knees nearly buckled, followed immediately by shame so sharp it stole his breath. "Thank you. Don't thank me." She looked up at him then, and her eyes were clear and fierce, and rimmed with a redness that said she had been crying before he arrived, but would die before admitting it. I'm not staying for you. I'm staying because people in Brackenmere were hurt because the wards failed, and I can fix that, and I won't let your mess cost more lives." The words landed like a slap, precise and earned. He took them. Calder stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The room felt too small for both of them, too small for the bond that filled the space between their bodies like heat from a fire. "Revna, I know what I did was wrong. Do you?" she asked, and her voice was gentle, which was infinitely worse than shouting. She could have screamed at him and it would have hurt less. "Do you know Calder? Or do you just know that it's not working out the way you planned?" He flinched at the use of his name. She'd only used it once before, in the throne room, hearing it now. Stripped of titles, just his name in her mouth like something both precious and painful, made his chest constrict. "Because there's a difference," Revna continued, her voice steady and measured. "Regretting the consequences is not the same as regretting the choice, and I need to know which one this is before I can hear anything else you have to say." Calder opened his mouth, closed it. The honest answer was more complicated than either option she'd offered, and he could see in her face that she knew that. "Both," he said. "It's both, and I know that's not enough." "No," she agreed, quietly. "It isn't." She stood. The room was small, and standing put her close to him, barely 2 feet between them, close enough that her scent wrapped around him and his wolf surged forward behind his eyes with desperate, aching recognition. He could feel the bond vibrating between them like a plucked string, that magnetic, desperate pull that had kept him awake for weeks, and he could see by the slight catch in her breathing, the dilation of her pupils, the way her hands clenched at her sides, that she felt it too, just as strongly, just as painfully. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused and right, and the contact sent a shock through both of them, sharp and electric and absolute, and the room tilted. Revna gasped. Calder's vision went white. When it cleared, they were standing in the Luna Wing, but not the real Luna Wing. This was the Luna Wing as it should have been, as the bond wanted it to be. Warm golden light filled every corner. Wildflowers spilled from vases on every surface. Heather and foxglove and meadow sweet, the kind that grew wild in Thornfeld. The wardstones glowed softly in the walls, steady and strong, and humming with a contentment that vibrated in her bones. And through the east windows, Ashenmoor's border stretched out green and whole and protected, the ward line blazing like a ribbon of silver from horizon to horizon, unbroken. "What is this?" Revna whispered. "The bond," Calder said, and his voice cracked open like something breaking. "This is what it sees, what it wants, what it's been trying to show me every night when I close my eyes and reach for someone who isn't there." They were standing face to face in the vision, closer than they'd been since she'd left, and the light from the wardstones painted her skin in gold. He could feel everything through the bond, now amplified and raw, strict of every wall and defense they both built. Her pain, her longing, the stubborn, ferocious love she carried for him that she refused to let him see, because seeing it would make her vulnerable, and she had been vulnerable once, and he had failed her. And beneath it, the fear, the bone-deep terror that he would choose wrong again, that she would open her heart and he would close a door on it. The vision shattered. They were back in her quarters, his hand still holding hers, both of them breathing hard, their faces inches apart. Revna pulled her hand free. She stepped back, and the distance opened between them like a wound torn fresh. "You have to choose," she said. And her voice was shaking, but her eyes were steady. "Not because the wards need it, not because the bond demands it, not because your council is arguing about border strategy." She swallowed hard and pressed her hand to her own chest, to the place where the bond lived, where it ached. "Here, and until you can say that, until you can stand in front of your court and choose me, not because you have to, but because you want to, I won't stay." I can't. Her voice dropped. I deserve more than being the answer to a problem you caused. Calder stared at her. The words he needed were right there, crowding against his teeth, desperate and true and terrifying. 3 words. That's all it would take. 3 words and a lifetime of meaning them, but the fear was there too. The weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. The lives on the northern border. The promise he'd made to a man whose daughter deserved better than to be discarded. The knowledge that choosing Revna meant breaking something else, and he was so tired of breaking things. Revna? He started. Good night, Your Majesty, she said. And the title, after hearing his name on her lips, felt like a door slamming shut. She closed the door between them, and Calder stood in the empty corridor and pressed his forehead against the wood and tried to remember how to breathe. On the other side of the door, Revna slid to the floor with her back against the frame, pressed both hands over her mouth, and finally, after weeks of composure and grace, and that devastating impossible smile, let herself cry. Calder did not sleep that night. He sat in his study with the fire dying and the shadows stretching long across the walls, and did the thing he had been avoiding since the moment Revna had placed the circlet on the table and walked out of the throne room. He sat with the truth, not the political truth, not the strategic calculus of borders and alliances and the careful arithmetic of lives weighed against other lives, the other truth, the one that lived in the place behind his ribs where the bond had carved its home and refused to leave. He loved her. He had loved her from the moment the bond recognized her at the harvest ceremony, when she'd been standing in the 3rd row with dye-stained hands and a streak of indigo on her jaw, laughing at something the woman beside her had said. His wolf had stopped mid-stride, his heart had stopped mid-beat, and every cell in his body had rearranged itself around a single devastating certainty. Her. He had known then. He had known through every one of the 6 weeks that followed, through every morning in the Luna Wing, every evening when her voice softened something inside him that had been rigid for years. He had known when he placed the circlet in her hair and his hands had trembled, and she'd looked up at him with such open, trusting hope that it had cracked him down the center, and he had chosen Melisande anyway, not because he didn't love Revna, because he did, because loving her terrified him in a way that politics never could. Politics were calculable. Love was not. A border alliance could be negotiated, quantified, controlled. A fated bond was an earthquake, and Calder had spent his entire reign building structures that could not withstand shaking. He was afraid. That was the truth. He'd been circling for weeks the one Revna had named in her quiet, devastating way, without ever saying the word. He was a coward. The fire went out. The room went dark. And in the darkness, Calder pressed his hands over his face and breathed. And his breath shook, and he did not try to stop it. He thought about his father. The old king had been many things, stern, demanding, impossible to please, but he had loved Calder's mother with a ferocity that had defined his reign. When she died, he had sealed her chambers for a year and refused to enter them. The court had whispered about weakness. His father hadn't cared. Love is not a weakness, the old king had told him once, standing in this same study, looking out the same window. Cowardice in the face of love is. Calder had not understood then. He understood now. Dawn came, gray and heavy, and with it a messenger. The western ward line near Thornfeld had collapsed entirely, not weakened, not flickered. Collapsed. The stone had gone black overnight, cracking down its center with a sound the village sentries described as a scream. And with it the barrier protecting the village and 3 surrounding settlements had simply ceased to exist. Scouts reported rogue movement in the hills, at least 2 packs, emboldened by the darkness already descending. Without the ward, there was nothing between the rogues and the villages, but open ground and whatever local defenses could be mustered. Calder was on his feet before the messenger finished speaking. He reached the ward chamber in minutes, taking the stairs 3 at a time, and found Revna already there. She was standing over the map table, with Helwyn tracing the dead section of the ward line with one finger. Her face was pale, her jaw set, her eyes sharp with the particular intensity of someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. "I need to go to Thornfeld," she said when she saw him. "Not a request. A statement? Absolutely not." The words came out before he could think, raw and instinctive, and her eyes flashed with a fury that should have warned him. "Those are my people, Calder. The village I grew up in. The people who raised me when no one else would. Ceres is there, the children I used to mind are there." Her voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "I am going. The Rogues could reach the village before you do," Calder said, his voice rising. "If the ward is down, there's no protection. You'd be walking into an open breach with no barrier and no guard." "Then send guards with me," Revna shot back. "But I am going, with or without your permission, because, unlike some people, I don't abandon the things I care about when it gets difficult." The words hit him like a fist to the sternum. He deserved them. He knew he deserved them, and he also knew, with a sickening clarity, that she was right. They rode hard for Thornfeld. Calder brought 50 wolves, his best fighters, with Oswin commanding the forward line. Revna rode beside him in silence, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the western horizon. The bond thrummed between them with every shared mile, and for once neither of them tried to suppress it. There wasn't time for pretense. They reached the breach site at midday. The ward stone sat in its iron cradle on the hillside above the village, a dead, black, lightless thing. The air around it felt wrong, thin. Like the atmosphere itself had thinned where the magic should have been. Revna dismounted and walked toward the stone without hesitation. Calder followed, his wolf pressing forward, every instinct screaming at him to put himself between her and a danger he could feel gathering at the edges. She placed her hands on the stone. Nothing happened. She pressed harder, her eyes closing, her breathing deepening. The stone remained dark. Revna's jaw clenched. She pushed, and Calder felt it through the bond, felt her reaching into the ward network with everything she had, pouring her own energy into the dead stone, trying to restart a heart that had stopped. The stone flickered. A single, weak pulse of blue, there and gone. Revna gasped and pushed harder. The flicker came again, steadier this time, and the ward line sparked to life for a few feet on either side. But something was wrong. The magic wasn't flowing from the network into the stone. It was flowing from Revna into the stone. The ward was drawing on her life force, pulling the energy directly from her body because the bond was incomplete, and the network had no other source. "Revna?" "Stop," Calder said, stepping forward. He could see it now, the way her skin had gone ashen, the way her hands were trembling against the stone, the way the blue light was tinged with something darker at the edges. She didn't stop. The ward line extended further, the barrier climbing back into existence foot by foot. Shimmering and fragile, the village below was being protected. She was protecting it with her own life. "Revna," he grabbed her shoulders. She swayed. "Almost," she whispered. "Almost there." Her knees buckled. Calder caught her before she hit the ground, pulling her against his chest, her hands falling away from the stone. The ward light died. Instantly, the barrier vanished, and Revna went limp in his arms. "No," the word came out broken. "Animal." A sound dragged from somewhere deeper than language. He sank to his knees on the hillside, cradling her against him, his hand on her face, her skin cold under his palm. "No, no, no. Revna, open your eyes." She didn't move. Her breathing was shallow, thread-like. Barely there, hoofbeats behind him. A voice he didn't expect. Millicent, riding hard up the hill with her father's standard-bearer behind her. She dismounted and stopped 3 paces away, looking at the king on his knees in the dirt, holding the woman he loved like she was the only solid thing left in the world. "You need to complete the bond," Millicent said, her voice steady and clear. "The wards are killing her because the bond is unfinished. They're drawing on her because they have no other source. Complete the bond, and the network will stabilize. Calder looked up at her, and whatever she saw in his face made her own expression soften into something that looked like relief. The engagement is dissolved, she said. Not a question. A release. My father will be furious, but my father will survive. Go. Choose her. She paused, and the faintest smile touched her mouth. Be brave for once. She turned and walked back to her horse, and the grace with which she released him from his own cowardice was so familiar, so achingly reminiscent of another woman's grace in another room on another terrible day, that Calder's eyes burned. Two women who deserved better, both braver than the king. Revna woke in the Luna Wing. She knew it before she opened her eyes. The scent was unmistakable. Old stone and moonlight and the faintest lingering trace of dried wildflowers. The east window was to her left. She could feel the morning light on her face, warm and golden, falling through the glass in the particular honeyed way that had made her fall in love with this room the first time she'd seen it. She was in the bed, the Luna's bed. The sheets were soft and smelled of clean linen, and there was a weight on the mattress beside her, warm and solid and close. Revna opened her eyes. Calder sat on the edge of the bed, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. He hadn't changed his clothes. There was dirt on his boots, on his trousers, ground into the fabric from kneeling on a hillside. His hair was disheveled, his shoulders rigid, and even from behind she could see the tremor in his hands. "How long was I out?" she asked, her voice rough. He turned so fast he nearly fell off the bed. The relief that flooded his face was so raw, so unguarded, so completely stripped of every wall he'd ever built, that it stole her breath. 14 hours, he said, his voice cracked. 14 hours, Revna. You nearly died. She tried to sit up. The room tilted. His hands were on her shoulders, immediately steadying her, and the contact sent the bonds singing through both of them, bright and desperate. The wards, she started. Forget the wards. His voice came out rough and savage and shaking. Forget the wards and forget the alliance and forget every single decision I've made since the day I met you, because every one of them was wrong and I knew they were wrong, and I did them anyway because I was afraid. Revna stared at him. I'm not choosing you because of the wards, he said, and his gray eyes were bright with unshed tears. I need you to hear that. I am not choosing you because the magic demands it, or because the border needs it, or because my council advised it. I am choosing you because when I held you on that hillside and I thought you were dying, the wards didn't matter. The kingdom didn't matter, nothing mattered except you, and I should have known that from the beginning. He swallowed hard. I did know, I've always known. I was just too much of a coward to say it. Revna's composure, that magnificent, terrible, unbreakable composure that had carried her through the throne room and the dye house and every long night of missing him, shattered like glass. You hurt me, she whispered, and the words were raw and honest and cost her everything. You let me hope, and then you took it away, and I had to walk out of that room with 300 people watching me, and I smiled because if I didn't smile I was going to break, and I would not give them that. I would not give you that. I know, he said, and a tear tracked down his face. I know what I took from you, and I still loved you, she continued, her voice breaking. That's the worst part. I still loved you while I was walking away. I loved you in the dye house, when you showed up pretending to inspect wards. I loved you when I came back and mended your stupid cloak. I have loved you every single day since the harvest ceremony, and it has been the most painful thing I have ever endured, and I am so tired of pretending it doesn't matter. Calder reached for her face, cupping her jaw with both hands. It matters. You matter. You are the only thing that has ever mattered. And I'm sorry, I am so sorry, Revna. I should have chosen you in front of everyone without hesitation. You deserve that, and I failed you, and I will spend the rest of my life earning what you gave me for free in that throne room. What did I give you? She whispered. Grace, he said. You gave me grace I didn't deserve. She kissed him. It was not gentle, it was not careful. It was the kiss of a woman who had been holding herself together with nothing but willpower and dignity for weeks, and she was done holding. She pulled him toward her and poured every suppressed emotion into it, every sleepless night, every aching morning, every moment of watching him from across a room and pretending she was fine. Calder responded with equal desperation, his hands sliding into her hair, his mouth hungry and reverent and shaking against hers. He kissed her like she was oxygen and he had been drowning. Like every word he'd failed to say was trying to find its way through his lips instead. I need to do this properly, he said against her mouth, breathing hard. In front of the court. In front of everyone. I don't need a ceremony, Revna said. I do. He pulled back, holding her face, his thumbs brushing the tears from her cheeks. I need to stand where I stood when I made the worst decision of my life, and make the right one. I need them to see me choose you. Not because I have to, because I want to. His voice dropped to something soft and raw and absolute. Because I love you. And I should have said it first, and I should have said it in that room. And I should have said it every day for the last 6 weeks, instead of destroying everything good I've ever been given. Revna pressed her forehead against his. Then say it now, I love you, he said, and the words sounded like they'd been trying to escape for a very long time. I love you, Revna. I love your blue hands and your terrible tea and the way you hum when you work, and the way you walked out of that throne room like a queen even though I'd just told the world you weren't one. She laughed through her tears. The sound filled the Luna wing like light. He held her. She let him. And for the first time in weeks, neither of them was pretending. That afternoon, Calder stood in the throne room, the same dais, the same 300 faces staring up at him. Lord Heron stood to the left, his jaw tight, his daughter beside him. Revna stood at the back, near the doors, because she refused to stand at the front until she was asked. I made a mistake, Calder said. His voice carried through the silence, clear and steady and stripped of everything except the truth. 6 weeks ago, I stood here and chose an alliance over a bond. I chose strategy over love. I chose what was safe over what was right, and a woman I didn't deserve walked out of this room with more grace than I have shown in my entire reign. The court was utterly still. I stand here now to correct that mistake, not because the words demanded, not because the magic requires a Luna, because I love Revna of Thornfeld, and I should have said so the first time, and I am done being afraid. He looked at her across the room. If you'll have me? If you can forgive me, if you'll come back, not for the wards, for me. Revna stood by the doors, her hands clasped in front of her, tears streaming silently down her face. She walked forward, 42 steps, the same as before, but this time everyone was toward him. She reached the dais. He stepped down to meet her, not above her, beside her. You're an idiot, she said softly. I know, he agreed. She took his hand. The mating was not a public affair. Some things belonged only to them. That night in the Luna wing, with the candles burning and the wildflowers she had picked herself on the windowsill, and the ward stones humming softly in the walls, Calder pressed his lips to the curve of her neck, and the bond snapped into place, like the final piece of something that had always been whole. Revna held him closer, claiming him as hers, and the bond blazed golden and warm and absolute, connecting them in a way that went deeper than skin, deeper than bone, deeper than the ancient ward stones themselves. The ward network ignited. Every stone in Ashemor blazed simultaneously, the light racing along the lines carved into the earth, spreading from the Luna wing to the borders in a wave of silver fire. Helwyn, sitting in her chamber 3 floors below, felt it and wept. The western border sealed, the northern line strengthened. The kingdom's magic, starved for so long, drank deep and held. Calder fell asleep with Revna in his arms, his breathing deepening within minutes. No restlessness, no waking, no wolf clawing him back to consciousness. For the first time since the harvest ceremony, her wolf was quiet, not restless, not aching, just still, just home. Revna lay awake for a while, watching the ward light pulse softly in the walls, feeling the bond hum between them like music. She had walked away from this room once. She had placed the circlet on the table and counted 42 steps to the door and smiled when every part of her was screaming. She hadn't known if she would ever come back. She closed her eyes. The bond glowed warm in her chest, steady as a second heartbeat. She slept. She woke inside the vision. Not the Luna Wing vision, not the golden, perfect version the bond had shown them before. This was something else, entirely darker. Colder raw in a way that scraped against her nerves like sandpaper. Revna stood in the throne room, but it was wrong. The light was gray and flat, the stone walls stripped of banners, the iron sconces empty and cold. The air carried the metallic taste of dread and something older, something that reminded her of the ward stones when they went dark. The 300 seats were empty, each one casting its own shadow, and the dais was bare except for a single figure. Calder knelt with his head bowed, his hands flat on the stone floor, his shoulders carrying a weight that she could feel through the bond like a physical pressure against her own chest. "Calder," she said, moving toward him. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hall, too loud, swallowed by the silence and thrown back at her in distorted repetitions. He didn't respond. He was staring at something on the floor in front of him. Revna followed his gaze and her breath caught the luna's circlet. Silver and moonstone, resting on the cold stone exactly where she had placed it the day she walked away. And around it, radiating outward in concentric circles, were versions of the moment, playing and replaying like reflections in broken mirrors. Revna, placing the circlet down. Revna smiling. Revna turning away, the doors closing. Over and over and over in every reflection, a different angle, a different detail, but always the same devastating conclusion. She left. He let her. He chose wrong. In one reflection, she was crying and didn't know it, tears tracking down her cheeks while her smile stayed fixed and perfect. In another, the crowd was not watching her, but watching him, and every face wore an expression of quiet contempt. In the closest one, the circlet hit the table, and the sound it made was not silver on wood, but something living, breaking. "What is this?" Revna whispered. "His fear," said a voice she didn't recognize. Revna spun and found herself facing a woman who looked like her, but wasn't quite the same height, the same build, but older, harder, with eyes that held no warmth and hands that weren't stained with dye, but with something darker. She wore Revna's face like a mask, and behind it there was nothing but cold air. "Who are you?" Revna asked, her pulse climbing. "I'm what he thinks he deserves," the woman said. She smiled, and it was a terrible smile. Revna's own smile twisted into something cruel and knowing. "The version of you that hates him, the one that should have screamed instead of smiled, the one that proves what he already knows about himself." "And what's that?" Revna asked, her voice steady, despite the cold crawling up her spine. "That he will always choose wrong. That he is, at his core, the kind of man who destroys good things. That every person who trusts him will eventually walk away, and he will deserve it every time." The shadow tilted her head. "You know I'm right. You thought it yourself, haven't you? In the dark, in Thornfeld, lying awake in a bed that smelled like dye instead of him. You wondered if he was capable of love at all, or if you'd imagined it." Rebna swallowed hard because the shadow wasn't lying. She had thought that in the worst moments, in the 3 in the morning loneliness, she had wondered. She looked at Calder, still kneeling on the dais, still watching the circlet replaying its awful loop through the bond. She could feel what he felt. Not guilt exactly, though guilt was threaded through every fiber of it. Something worse than guilt? Conviction. A deep, Immovable certainty that his nature was to fail the people who loved him, that he had been given something precious, and shattered it, and no amount of correction could change the fundamental flaw in him that had allowed it to happen. The flaw that had let him look at a woman he loved and choose politics instead. Not because politics mattered more, but because politics was safer. Because loving someone meant they could leave you, and if you never fully committed, the leaving wouldn't hurt as much. He believed this. Truly, wholly down to the marrow of his bones. This was not a nightmare. This was his identity. This was the story he told himself in the dark when the wolf was quiet and there was nothing left between him and the truth. Revna walked toward the dais, the false version of herself stepped into her path, blocking her way with a body that cast no shadow. "He doesn't deserve your forgiveness," the shadow said. "You know that you walked away once. You should have stayed away. A woman who values herself doesn't go back to the man who threw her away." Revna met the shadow's eyes and felt nothing but pity. Because she recognized this creature, not just as Calder's fear wearing her face. Though it was that too, she recognized it as the voice in her own head, the one that had whispered to her in Thornfeld, in the dye house, on the cart, ride back to Ashen Moor, in every sleepless night since the announcement. "You weren't enough. If you had been enough, he would have chosen you. You are a dyer's daughter from a border village, and you will never be enough for a king." She had carried her own version of this shadow for her entire life, long before Calder, the foundling's whisper. The girl with no family's certainty that she would never be chosen first, because she had never been chosen first, because no one had ever looked at her and said, "You, above all others, you, until Calder." Who had looked at her exactly that way, and then been too afraid to follow through move? Revna said to the shadow. "He'll hurt you again, maybe," Revna said. "And maybe I'll hurt him. That's what love is. You show up and you try, and sometimes you get it wrong and you try again. It's not about being perfect. It's about being brave enough to stay." She paused. "And I'm staying." She stepped through the shadow like it was smoke. It dissolved behind her, curling away into nothing, and the cold dissolved with it. Revna climbed the steps of the dais and knelt beside Calder. He didn't look up. The circlet kept replaying its loop on the floor between them. The sound of silver on wood. The sound of something breaking, over and over. She reached out and picked it up. The loop stopped. The reflection shattered like glass, falling away into silence. The throne room fell still. "Look at me," she said slowly. Like a man surfacing from deep water, Calder raised his head. His eyes found hers, and the devastation in them was so complete it made her heart crack. "You chose wrong," she said, and he flinched. But she held his gaze. "You made a terrible, cowardly, hurtful choice. You broke my heart in front of 300 people, and I had to walk out of this room smiling because the alternative was falling apart. And I refused to fall apart." His breathing was ragged. She could feel him bracing for the verdict, for the final confirmation that he was what he feared. "And then you chose right," she continued, her voice softening. "You came to Thornfeld. You sent for me. You held me on a hillside when I was dying, and you said my name like it was the only word you knew. You stood in this room, this actual room, and told 300 people you loved me." She pressed the circlet into his hands. "One bad choice does not make you a bad man, Calder. It makes you a man who got scared, and being scared is not the same as being broken." His hands closed around the circlet. His head dropped forward until his forehead rested against her shoulder. "I don't know how to stop being afraid," he said. And the admission was so small and so honest it shattered whatever was left of the walls between them. "You don't have to stop," Revna whispered against his hair. "You just have to choose anyway. That's all bravery is. Fear plus choice." The throne room dissolved, the gray light warmed to gold. The ward stones blazed in the walls, and the bond flared between them, brighter than it had ever been, filling every corner of both of them, with a warmth that felt like finally coming home. They woke in the Luna wing, in each other's arms, in the bed that was theirs now, surrounded by ward light, so bright it painted the ceiling in silver. Calder held her tighter. Revna felt his tears against her neck and held him while he shook. "I love you," he said. "I know," she replied. "I've always known, even when you didn't." The Luna wing was never empty again. Wildflowers filled every surface. Heather and foxglove and meadowsweet replaced every few days by Revna herself, who insisted on picking them from the hills despite having an entire staff who would have done it for her. The ward stones in the walls glowed with a steady, contented light that Helwyn said she had never seen in 40 years of ward-keeping. The east window caught the morning sun and turned it to honey, and most mornings Revna sat beside it with a cup of nettle tea and watched the border shimmer silver on the horizon. The wards held. Every stone blazed strong along the full length of Ashen Moor's borders, western and northern alike. Lord Heron's fury had cooled into grudging respect after Calder negotiated a new alliance, trade access and military cooperation without a marriage bond to seal it. Melisande had returned north with her head high and a letter from Revna in her pocket. 2 pages of gratitude and the promise of a friendship that would outlast the politics that had tangled them together. Calder slept. Every night, deeply, peacefully, with his mate beside him and his wolf finally blessedly still. He still had bad nights occasionally, nights where the old fear surfaced and the shadow whispered. But Revna was there, and she would reach for his hand in the dark, and the shadow would retreat. The court adjusted, as courts do, slowly and with extensive gossip. A dyer from a border village, as Luna, was not what anyone had envisioned. But the ward light in the Luna wing spoke for itself, and slowly even the most traditional voices conceded that the magic had chosen well. On a morning 3 months after the mating, Revna stood in front of the mirror in the Luna wing, turning the silver and moonstone circlet over in her hands. Calder watched from the bed, still half tangled in sheets, his chin propped on his arm. "You don't have to wear it," he said. "I know," Revna replied. She studied the circlet for a moment, then lifted it and placed it in her own hair. She looked at her reflection, then at him. She smiled, not the smile from the throne room, not the one that had been armor and farewell. This smile was open, unhurried, the smile of a woman who had walked away and come back, and been chosen properly by a man who had learned, painfully and late, but not too late, that love was not a strategic decision. Calder smiled back, his gray eyes soft, his face relaxed in a way she'd only ever seen when he slept. But he was awake. He was looking at her. "It suits you," he said. This time his voice did not crack.